Almost 3 years ago to the day, on April 22nd, 2021, the SLS Core Stage that would eventually fly Artemis 1 left Stennis Space Center in Mississippi at the completion of a successful Green Run design verification campaign. We're also approaching the 5-year anniversary of the rebranding of the NASA exploration programs as Artemis, but that period 5 years ago was also a time when SLS Core Stage delays seemed to surprise and upset NASA leadership. The delays finally made it clear at the beginning of 2019 that performing the test would jeopardize a first launch during the 2020 presidential campaign the next year, and helped put Green Run in jeopardy. As the new end of 2024 lunar landing goal became NASA's top priority in the spring of 2019, the space agency leadership at the time also revisited whether or not it could just launch the first SLS without a full test on the ground first. The answer came back pretty quickly that no, it was a bad idea, but not until after some not so subtle, but also not so logical public messaging. The value of learning on the ground and the insistence on performing the test was demonstrated when the first time that SLS fired the core stage at Green Run, it stopped only a minute into the 8-minute plan. By that time, outside factors like COVID-19 had already ended any realistic chances to make the end of 2024 lunar landing goal, but a discovery like that, forcing the first launch to be terminated in 2020 after racing for it, would probably have wiped out the 2024 goal all by itself. Due to things like the COVID-19 pandemic and secrecy restrictions, a lot of the memories of Green Run are being lost to history, but there are a few things like this that made it into the public eye at the time. It's March 27, 2019. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine is testifying in a House of Representatives committee hearing, and he is asked about the core stage Green Run. First, he talks about the consensus purpose for the test campaign. It was this part that was a real head-scratcher. Green Run was a stage test, not an engine test. The Space Shuttle program had already done that fleet leader testing of the engines years ago, before SLS existed. Repeating that would not change the probability of SLS first flight success. The core stage was the SLS rookie, not the engines. So what was going on here? NASA always refuses to talk about anything that is quote-unquote pre-decisional. So why was the administrator brainstorming during a congressional hearing? Canceling the Green Run wasn't going to maximize chances of first flight success. It would keep alive the hope of a lunar spectacular for the 2020 campaign, at least for a little while. But this was one of the political gestures that was harder to understand, maybe because it was technical brainstorming instead of policy threats. Although a very unorthodox place for it, under oath in a congressional hearing, we're at the 5-year anniversary of this and other events that happened in the spring of 2019. First, a longer aside about the core stage and the Green Run. The core stage is a central element of SLS, and it was the only new piece to design and develop for the first version of the vehicle. It was probably the only piece NASA could afford to design and develop at the time, but I digress. All the other SLS pieces, the engines that the stage uses, the solid rocket boosters that give it the initial lift and acceleration out of the lower atmosphere, and the upper stage taken from the now retired Delta IV, were already flight proven or had completed development and qualification. As I've gone over in a recent video on core stage production, it is also the most complicated element for the initial operating capability. The stage uses key heritage space shuttle hardware, like the space shuttle main engines, but is otherwise a new design. I'll put a link above to that video in case you want to start there. The Green Run campaign was the only opportunity for the SLS program to see the real interactions between the complicated stage systems in a test environment before it flew. The data was used to certify the design was ready for its first launch. At the beginning of March 2019, the test was heavily delayed. Without the money up front to build a dedicated propulsion test article, like the Space Shuttle program did, Green Run would have to use the first flight article, which would be the very first working unit. As is typical for doing something for the first time, production was behind schedule. A NASA Inspector General report was released in October 2018 that stated that NASA and prime contractor Boeing would be unable to support a first SLS launch in mid-2020 and probably not until 2021. As reported after all the pronouncements in March 2019, Boeing acknowledged how bad the delays were to NASA leadership early in 2019. Judging by the response, this seemed to surprise and upset NASA and administration leadership. Their actions spoke loudly about how important the 2020 launch date was to the administration, but canceling the Green Run was one of the final initiatives that became public that month. Even before those initiatives became public, the Trump administration had already decided to prioritize the lunar landing goal, and to help get that started, they took money away from SLS. They proposed in the fiscal year 2020 request to defund upgrades to the SLS and infrastructure indefinitely, which was another name for cancellation of Exploration Upper Stage, Block 1B, and Mobile Launcher 2. That money could then be moved over to, in that budget request, still unspecified lunar landing technology development. That request was partially released on March 11th, and then 2 days later in a congressional hearing, NASA Administrator Bridenstine announced that the Launch Services Program would study whether Exploration Mission 1, the first flight to the moon for the exploration programs, could be accomplished without SLS. So now it was Congress's turn to be surprised, this time about threatening the project that many who still were there had saved from threats by the previous administration under President Obama. It's certainly interesting that two presidents that didn't agree about almost anything in this case agreed they wanted to get rid of SLS. Another oddity about that March 27th idea is that it came after the pushback from key congressional leadership and the alternate EM1 study 2 weeks earlier. Congress wanted to keep SLS, and alternatives would be more expensive up front, something else that Congress didn't like. It also came a day after Vice President Pence's speech at Marshall Space Flight Center, where he called out Boeing without using their name.
But to be clear, we're not committed to any one contractor. If our current contractors can't meet this objective, then we'll find ones that will. If American industry can provide critical commercial services without government development, then we'll buy them. And if commercial rockets are the only way to get American astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets it will be.
The idea of skipping the Green Run to theoretically save many months of schedule was something being discussed many months earlier in the middle of 2018, since there was plenty of awareness of the production delays by that time, and the Inspector General's office was already investigating at that point. The idea was to substitute a short launch pad static fire, something that could only last a few seconds, versus the full duration 500-second test at Stennis. That was only discussed in private in 2018, but it went public in March 2019, with Administrator Bridenstine announcing multiple stopgap efforts to fly Orion to the moon before the 2020 election, either with or without SLS. The full version of the budget request document, which is called the Congressional Justification Document, was released on March 18, 2019, and buried in there was another strong signal that by the beginning of March, the administration's priority was to speed up the EM-1 launch schedule and fly it before 2020 ended, with or without SLS. We see that NASA had already started internal efforts on March 4th to find ways to get the EM-1 Orion spacecraft out to the moon the next year. Although parts of the budget request were released on March 11th, these details were withheld until the 18th to give NASA and Bridenstine time to explain the cuts being proposed, including to SLS, and to dramatize the need for an election year launch of EM-1. At the end of the month, it was pretty clear that NASA was going to have to fly EM-1 with SLS, so the question now was about the 2020 launch date. By the time all the studies and speeches and brainstorming in public occurred in March 2019, Boeing had already made the fundamental production changes, and the SLS program had already signed off on them, because the tooling was already built and delivered to the Michoud assembly facility. Standalone core stage engine section integration was completed during this same month, and by the end of the month, the engine section had been stacked to the boat tail and placed on that new tooling. On April 1st, 2019, the next step in the new production plan was executed, moving the tool over to the final assembly area at MAF to complete integration and test of the engine section and boat tail. NASA oversight bodies, like the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, made a point in late April 2019 of re-emphasizing how important they viewed the Green Run campaign. In the minutes that were released, they note, in part, that the panel was aware that the administration was searching long and hard to try and speed up the EM-1 schedule. But they pretty bluntly opposed canceling the Green Run, whether it was for political reasons or not. In the public session after the second quarterly meetings at the Marshall Space Flight Center, a lot of stuff was happening at Marshall in the spring of 2019. In that public session, the chair of the panel, Dr. Patricia Sanders, said this:
"One of the most critical of these is the Green Run at Stennis. There is no other test approach that will gather the critical full-scale integrated propulsion system operational data required to ensure safe operation. Shorter duration engine firings at the launch pad will not achieve an understanding of the operational margins and could result in severe consequences if conducted in a much less controlled environment than Stennis, and if the margins are exceeded. I cannot emphasize more strongly that we advise NASA to retain this test content in the program of the work."
The panel reiterated this again in early June at their next meeting. In testimony to Congress a few weeks later, on May 8th, then NASA Associate Administrator Bill Gerstenmaier also noted other reasons why a full-duration test was important to verify the design of the new stage around the old shuttle liquid rocket engines.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, can you, without getting too deep in the bushes, just give me a little brief summary of the benefits of an SLS Green Run?
So I think that the simplest advantage is it allows us to see the integrated system work as an integrated system. The engines actually pressurize the tank for the Space Launch System, and that's a very complex mathematical model of how the cryogenic propellants and things interact. And the really way to see all that is in a full-up integrated test. You can test individual components, but you can't test it as an integrated system as well as you can for a fairly long duration test of the Green Run.
Okay.
We're referring to the record of a congressional hearing, but this isn't a congressional hearing. It is the place to get into the bushes and weeds. The stage used predominantly all new components and subsystems around the shuttle engines, and one of the many things the test would provide was data to validate those mathematical models. A few weeks later, I got a chance to ask NASA's Jonathan Lucer in the SLS program about this at a media event at Michoud Assembly Facility.
I'm Jonathan Lucer, Jonathan Lucer, Looser. I'm the NASA Core Stage propulsion lead.
Following up at that media event on Gerstenmaier's testimony earlier in the year, I asked Lucer, who today is the SLS Core Stage design team lead for NASA, about how the data from the Green Run would help anchor some of those models.
So now I know we were asking about the Green Run, one of the things that they're interested in was seeing how obviously you get a much better idea of performance of the system if you let the engines run for minutes versus a few seconds.
Right.
And obviously the tank's not really going to drain very much if we don't run it for a while. So the Green Run will is going to give you more data on just kind of same thing of modeling,
anchoring
those
your models. Yeah, the pressurization model is the one that we would like to get the most data at Green Run, right? Because you can model tank thermodynamics. But this tank is larger, it's thicker materials, seeing how the pressure and gas with 4 engines flowing hot pressure into the tank, and that interaction of the pressure and gas and the hot pressure and gas and the cryogenic liquid level surface, there's just some uncertainties there with the different size tank and the different dome shapes, and so that's something that we really want to anchor that model with some test data. And if you run for a few seconds, you really don't get down into the lower parts of the tank where you have more warm gas and you have cryogenic propellants in there. So understanding all the thermodynamics that are going on inside that tank, something we really want to do a full duration hot fire.
So it seemed that the conclusion was that skipping major tests and flying Orion and SLS before the 2020 election was more likely to increase the chances that Artemis 1 would fail rather than succeed. NASA's internal technical re-evaluation came to the same conclusion as it had at the beginning of the decade and the beginning of the SLS program, that the Green Run should be conducted. That very public messaging from the administration about the 2020 schedule being the top priority didn't last into April 2019, and in late July, NASA publicly announced that it was keeping the Green Run, without saying that it had no choice. The agency did cancel the Green Run for the second core stage at that time. Canceling the Green Run was part of the Trump administration's attempts at a power play, shaking things up in hopes of taking over control of space policy. That didn't work out, but there was one more shakeup in that period. In July, Bridenstine fired Gerstenmaier as the head of NASA's Human Spaceflight Directorate. The position remained open until late in the year. That's another situation that didn't work out well, but is a story for another time. After waiting for a detailed plan from the administration for months, Congress quietly but largely ignored the budget requests from the administration during that appropriation cycle and maintained funding for the existing policies and priorities. The production changes that Boeing implemented allowed them to finish Core Stage 1 by New Year's 2020, and it arrived at Stennis and was installed in the B-2 test stand there just a few weeks before COVID-19 became a global pandemic and literally changed everything. For the Green Run alone, it stopped work for 2 full months from mid-March to mid-May of 2020. The value of the design verification campaign was further underscored by the premature cutoff during the first attempt to hotfire the stage on January 16, 2021. The test ended only 67 seconds after the first engine start command, when the start of the first stress test of the stage caused its hydraulic systems to trip test criteria limits and the stage aborted the test. If SLS had instead aborted in flight after 67 seconds, it would have prevented Orion from even conducting Artemis 1 and forced the flight test to be tried again, using hardware that NASA did not have available, even by the time that Artemis 1 did fly at the end of 2022. As we see today, 5 years after the decision, the second Orion SLS vehicle still has not completed production. If the Artemis 1 mission had been lost before it started, it's not clear, especially given the huge disruption that COVID caused to supply chains, when NASA would have been able to fly a second unit to retry Artemis 1. After another issue came up, the full-duration 500-second test was finally conducted on March 18, 2021, and the stage departed Stennis on April 22nd on the Pegasus barge, headed to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. As it turned out, COVID was still a major player in 2021, and Artemis 1 didn't fly for another year and a half after it arrived at KSC. If NASA had skipped the Green Run and shipped the core stage to Florida in early 2020, Artemis 1 still would not have flown that election year. Thanks as always for watching. If you found this video interesting, click on the like button. I wrote many stories about the test over a 5-year period before and immediately after for NASA spaceflight, so there's more that could be said about trying to cover the Green Run over the years.